Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you would sacrifice everything for them, only to discover that your entire relationship was built on lies? Let me tell you about the most painful betrayal I've ever experienced. One that taught me the hardest lesson about trust, family, and the importance of protecting yourself even when you're grieving. My name is Sarah, and for 5 long years, I sent $380 every single month to my late husband's mother, believing I was honoring his memory and taking care of the woman who raised the man I loved more than life itself. I scraped together that money even when my own electricity was about to be shut off, even when I had to choose between buying groceries and paying that monthly obligation, even when my friends told me I was being taken advantage of. I thought I was doing the right thing, keeping a sacred promise I had made to my dying husband as he lay in that hospital bed, his hand growing cold in mine. But everything I believed, everything I sacrificed, every tear I cried while transferring that money into her account, it was all based on a lie so cruel, so calculated, so absolutely devastating that when I finally discovered the truth, I didn't know whether to scream, to cry, or to simply disappear into the void of my own shattered reality. This is my story, and I need to tell it because I know there are others out there who might be going through something similar, who might be sacrificing themselves for people who don't deserve their loyalty, their love, or their hard-earned money. It all started 8 years ago when I met James at a coffee shop in downtown Portland. I remember that day so vividly, like it's burned into my memory with perfect clarity. I had just finished a terrible job interview, feeling completely defeated and questioning every decision I'd made in my life up to that point. My confidence was shattered, my bank account was nearly empty, and I walked into that coffee shop just wanting to sit in a corner and disappear for a while. The place smelled like freshly ground coffee beans and cinnamon, and there was this soft jazz music playing in the background that somehow made everything feel a little less hopeless. I ordered a simple black coffee because that was all I could afford, and as I turned to find a seat, I literally bumped into him. My coffee splashed everywhere, mostly on his expensive-looking white shirt, and I was mortified. I started apologizing profusely, grabbing napkins, trying to clean up the mess I'd made, feeling like this was just the perfect ending to an absolutely terrible day. But James, he just laughed. Not a polite, forced laugh, but a genuine, warm, from-the-belly kind of laugh that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. He told me not to worry, that the shirt was already headed for the donation pile anyway, and that if I really wanted to make it up to him, I could let him buy me another coffee and keep him company for a bit. There was something about his smile, about the kindness in his voice, about the way he made me feel like my catastrophic clumsiness was somehow charming instead of embarrassing, that made me say yes. We sat in that coffee shop for 4 hours, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his work as a graphic designer, about his passion for hiking and photography, about his dreams of one day opening his own design studio. I told him about my struggles to find my place in the world, about my love for reading and writing, about my fears and hopes and everything in between. By the time we left that coffee shop, I felt like I'd known him my entire life, like he was someone I'd been searching for without even realizing I was looking. Our relationship blossomed quickly after that first meeting, like a flower that had been waiting for just the right conditions to bloom. James was everything I had ever wanted in a partner, but never dared to hope I'd find. He was kind without being weak, confident without being arrogant, ambitious without being selfish. He remembered little details about things I'd mentioned in passing, like how I preferred daisies over roses because they reminded me of my grandmother's garden, or how I loved rainy Sundays because they gave me an excuse to stay in bed with a good book. He would surprise me with handwritten notes hidden in my purse or tucked into my jacket pocket, little messages that said things like, "Thinking of you," or "You make my world brighter," that would make my heart flutter every single time. We built a life together piece by piece, moment by moment, creating a foundation that I truly believed was unshakable. He introduced me to his mother, Margaret, about 3 months into our relationship. I remember being nervous about that meeting because I wanted so badly for her to like me, to approve of me, to see me as worthy of her son's love. Margaret lived in a modest apartment on the east side of town, and when we arrived for dinner that first time, she greeted us at the door with a warm smile and a tight hug for James. She was a small woman, probably in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes that reminded me so much of James's. The apartment was clean but cluttered, filled with photographs of James at various ages and knickknacks that she'd apparently collected over the years. She served us a home-cooked meal of pot roast and vegetables, and throughout dinner, she told me stories about James's childhood, about what a sweet and thoughtful boy he'd been, about how proud she was of the man he'd become. I liked her immediately, and I felt grateful that James came from such a loving, caring mother. She seemed genuinely happy that James had found someone, and she told me that night that she could see how much we loved each other, that it was written all over our faces. James proposed to me on a hiking trail overlooking the Columbia River Gorge at sunset, with the sky painted in shades of orange and pink and purple that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. He got down on one knee right there on the trail, pulled out a simple but elegant ring, and asked me to spend the rest of my life with him. I said yes, before he even finished the question, tears streaming down my face, my heart so full of joy that I thought it might burst right out of my chest. We got married 6 months later in a small ceremony with close friends and family. Nothing extravagant or over the top, just an intimate celebration of our love and commitment to each other. Margaret was there, of course, sitting in the front row, crying happy tears as she watched her son marry the woman he loved. Our wedding day was perfect, absolutely perfect, and as James and I danced our first dance as husband and wife, I remember thinking that I was the luckiest woman in the world. We moved into a small but cozy apartment together, combined our lives and our belongings, started talking about our future, about maybe buying a house someday, about having children, about growing old together. James was working hard at his job, saving money so he could eventually start his own business, and I had finally found stable work as a content writer for a marketing firm. We weren't rich by any means, but we were happy, genuinely happy, and that felt like more than enough. Life felt full of possibilities, full of promise, full of all the beautiful things that come with being deeply in love with someone who loves you just as much in return. Then everything changed in a single, horrible moment that I relive in my nightmares almost every night. It was a Tuesday evening, completely ordinary, completely unremarkable, the kind of evening that you don't pay special attention to because you assume there will be thousands more just like it. James had texted me that he was leaving work and would be home in about 30 minutes, and I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming along to music playing from my phone, thinking about what movie we might watch together after we ate. But 30 minutes passed, then 45, then an hour, and he still wasn't home. I tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried texting, but got no response. A knot of worry started forming in my stomach, that primal, instinctive fear that something was wrong, even though I tried to rationalize it away by telling myself he probably just got caught in traffic or stopped to run an errand. But then my phone rang, and it was a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a calm, professional voice told me there had been an accident, that my husband had been taken to St. Vincent's Hospital, that I should come right away. The next few hours were a blur of fluorescent hospital lights, antiseptic smells, worried faces, and incomprehensible medical jargon. James had been hit by a drunk driver who ran a red light, T-boning his car on the driver's side. The impact had been severe, catastrophic, and despite the best efforts of the paramedics and the emergency room doctors, his injuries were too extensive. I sat by his bedside, holding his hand, begging him to fight, to stay with me, to not leave me alone in this world. He was barely conscious, slipping in and out, but in one of his brief moments of clarity, he squeezed my hand and whispered that he loved me, that he was sorry, that I needed to promise him something. I leaned in close, tears falling onto our joined hands, and told him I would promise him anything, anything at all. He said, in a voice so weak I could barely hear him, that I needed to take care of his mother, that she didn't have anyone else, that she would need help, financial help, and that he needed to know she'd be okay. I promised him without hesitation, promised him that I would take care of Margaret, that I would make sure she had everything she needed, that he didn't have to worry. He seemed to relax a little after that, and then he closed his eyes, and a few minutes later, the monitor started making that horrible, continuous beeping sound that means a heart has stopped beating. James was gone, just like that, ripped away from me before we'd even had a chance to truly begin our life together. I was 29 years old and suddenly a widow, drowning in a grief so profound that I didn't know how I would survive it. Have you ever experienced a loss so devastating that it fundamentally changes who you are as a person? Comment below if you've been through something that shattered your world completely. The weeks and months after James's death were the darkest period of my entire life, a time when I moved through each day like a ghost, going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. The funeral was a somber affair, filled with people offering their condolences and saying things like, "He's in a better place now," and "Time heals all wounds," platitudes that felt hollow and meaningless when I was drowning in such overwhelming pain. Margaret was there, of course, dressed in black, crying softly into a tissue, leaning on me for support even though I could barely support myself. After the funeral, After everyone had gone home and I was left alone in the apartment that still smelled like James, still had his clothes in the closet and his toothbrush by the sink, I remembered the promise I had made to him in the hospital. I remembered his dying wish that I take care of his mother, and even though I was struggling myself, even though I didn't know how I was going to pay my own bills or get through each day without falling apart completely, I knew I had to honor that promise. It was the last thing he had asked of me, and I couldn't bear the thought of letting him down, of breaking a vow I'd made as he took his final breaths. So I called Margaret and told her about the promise, told her that James had wanted me to help her financially, and asked her how much she needed each month. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in a voice that sounded both grateful and a little embarrassed, that she was struggling to make ends meet on her fixed income, that $380 a month would help tremendously with her rent and basic expenses. It was a significant amount of money for me, especially now that I only had one income instead of two, but I didn't hesitate. I set up an automatic monthly transfer from my account to hers, and I felt a small sense of peace knowing that I was honoring James's memory, that I was doing what he had asked of me, that I was taking care of the woman who had raised the man I loved. The first year after James's death, I was operating purely on autopilot, just trying to survive each day without completely falling apart. I threw myself into my work, taking on extra projects and overtime hours because staying busy meant less time to think, less time to feel, less time to miss him so intensely that it physically hurt. My friends tried to check in on me, tried to invite me to dinners and social gatherings, but I usually declined, preferring to stay home alone where I could cry without having to explain myself or pretend to be okay when I wasn't. The monthly payments to Margaret became a sort of ritual for me, something that connected me to James, a way of keeping the promise I'd made and honoring his memory. Every month, on the first of the month, I would transfer that $380, and sometimes I would sit there staring at the transaction confirmation, imagining James looking down and being proud of me for taking care of his mother like he'd asked. Margaret would send me a text each month thanking me, usually something simple like, "Received the money, thank you, dear," or, "You're so kind to do this." James would be proud. We didn't talk much beyond those monthly exchanges, which I attributed to the fact that we were both grieving and probably didn't want to burden each other with our pain. But as time went on and my financial situation became more precarious, those monthly payments started to become a real burden. My salary as a content writer wasn't huge to begin with, and without James's income to supplement it, I was struggling to make ends meet. I started having to make difficult choices, like whether to pay the full amount on my credit card or just the minimum so I could afford groceries. I skipped doctor's appointments because I couldn't afford the copays. I stopped going out with friends because I couldn't justify spending money on dinner or drinks when I was barely scraping by. My car needed repairs that I couldn't afford, so I started taking the bus instead, adding an hour to my commute each way. I developed a stress-related health issue that I ignored because I didn't have the money or the energy to deal with it. Despite these struggles, I never once considered stopping the payments to Margaret. In my mind, this was non-negotiable, a sacred promise that I had to keep no matter what. Sometimes I would eat ramen noodles for a week straight just to make sure I had enough money to send her that $380. I told myself that this was temporary, that eventually my financial situation would improve, that I just needed to work harder and be more frugal. My best friend Rachel started expressing concern about the arrangement. She would ask me why I was still sending so much money to Margaret, when I could barely afford my own rent, why I was sacrificing my own well-being for someone who wasn't even my blood relative. I would get defensive, telling her that she didn't understand, that this was about honoring James's memory, that Margaret needed this money, and I had made a promise. Rachel would shake her head and say that James wouldn't have wanted me to destroy myself financially, that he would have wanted me to take care of myself first. But I couldn't hear it. I was convinced that maintaining this connection to James through these payments was important, that it gave my suffering meaning, that it was the right thing to do no matter how hard it was. Looking back now, I can see that I was using these payments as a way to hold on to James, as a way to avoid fully accepting that he was gone, as a way to maintain some sense of connection to the life we'd planned together. But at the time, all I knew was that I had made a promise to my dying husband, and I was going to keep it even if it killed me. The payments continued month after month, year after year, becoming such a routine part of my life that I almost stopped thinking about them consciously. They were just something I did, like paying my rent or my phone bill, an obligation that I fulfilled without question even as my own financial situation deteriorated further. Around the 3-year mark after James's death, I started noticing some things that didn't quite add up, small inconsistencies that nagged at the edges of my awareness, but that I initially dismissed or rationalized away. I ran into one of Margaret's neighbors at the grocery store, a woman named Linda, who recognized me from the few times I'd visited Margaret's apartment with James. We chatted briefly, and Linda mentioned something about how nice it was that Margaret had been able to take so many trips lately, how she seemed to be doing really well and enjoying her retirement. I felt a small prickle of confusion because Margaret had never mentioned any trips to me, and I was under the impression that she could barely afford her basic living expenses, which was why she needed my monthly contributions. But I pushed the thought away, telling myself that maybe she'd received some unexpected windfall, or maybe Linda was confusing her with someone else. Another time, Margaret called me and asked if I could possibly send an extra $100 that month because she had some unexpected medical expenses. I felt terrible that she was dealing with health issues and immediately sent the money, even though it meant I would have to skip paying one of my own bills that month. But a few weeks later, I saw photos on Facebook that Margaret had been tagged in by one of her friends, photos from what looked like a nice restaurant, Margaret smiling and holding up a glass of wine, clearly enjoying herself. Again, I felt that nagging confusion, that sense that something didn't quite fit, but I talked myself out of it, telling myself that maybe the photos were old, or maybe a friend had treated her to the meal as a gift. I didn't want to be suspicious of Margaret, didn't want to question her integrity, because that would mean questioning the promise I'd made to James, and I wasn't ready to do that. The strange comments and behaviors continued to accumulate over the next several months, creating a pattern that became harder and harder to ignore. Margaret mentioned in passing during one of our rare phone calls that she'd redecorated her living room, which seemed odd for someone who claimed to be struggling financially. When I visited her apartment for the first time in over a year, bringing her a birthday gift, I noticed that she had a brand new television, much larger and nicer than the old one I remembered from my previous visits. She also had new furniture, new curtains, and several new decorative items that looked expensive. When I gently asked about these upgrades, she became flustered and changed the subject quickly, saying something vague about having done some bargain shopping and finding good deals. But the apartment didn't look like it had been furnished with bargain finds. It looked like she'd invested significant money in updating her living space. I also started noticing designer handbags in her closet when I used her bathroom during that visit, expensive-looking shoes and clothing with tags from upscale stores. None of this made sense for someone who supposedly needed $380 a month just to cover basic living expenses. I felt a growing unease in my stomach, a suspicion that I desperately didn't want to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would mean confronting a truth that could potentially destroy the last connection I had to James. I started paying more attention to Margaret's social media, something I'd never really done before, and I saw photos of her at various events, concerts, nice restaurants, and what appeared to be weekend getaways to the coast. She looked happy and healthy and certainly not like someone who was struggling to survive. Each new discovery felt like a small betrayal, like a tiny crack in the foundation of trust that I'd built my entire sacrifice upon. Then came the discovery that changed everything, the moment when the careful facade crumbled and I was forced to confront a reality I'd been unconsciously avoiding for years. It happened on a completely ordinary Saturday afternoon when I was doing something completely mundane, sorting through boxes of James's belongings that I'd finally worked up the courage to go through 4 years after his death. I'd kept these boxes in the back of my closet, unable to face the pain of looking through his things, but my therapist had suggested that it might help with my healing process to finally deal with them. I was sitting on my bedroom floor surrounded by his old clothes, books, and personal items, crying softly as I held one of his favorite sweaters to my face, breathing in the faint scent that still somehow lingered after all this time. At the bottom of one box, I found a folder containing various documents, insurance papers, old bills, and personal correspondence. I was about to set it aside without really looking through it when a bank statement fell out and caught my attention. It was from about 6 months before James died, and as I glanced at it, I saw a transaction that made my blood run cold. There was a recurring monthly transfer to Margaret for $500, every single month for as far back as the statement showed. I sat there staring at that paper, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. James had been sending his mother $500 a month, regularly, consistently, from his own account. I frantically searched through the rest of the folder and found more bank statements going back almost 2 years, and every single one showed that same monthly transfer, $500 every month, like clockwork. My hands started shaking as the implications of this discovery crashed over me like a wave. If James had been sending his mother $500 a month, why had she told me she needed $380 from me? Why had she acted like she was barely surviving when she'd been receiving substantial financial support from James for years before his death, and then additional money from me after? I felt like I was going to be sick, like the room was spinning around me and I couldn't quite catch my breath. I needed to know more, needed to understand what was happening, so I did something I'd never done before, something that felt invasive and wrong but also necessary. I logged into the email account that James and I had shared, an account we'd set up for household bills and shared expenses, and I started searching through old emails. What I found made everything so much worse. There were emails between James and Margaret going back years, conversations about her finances, and what I discovered shattered every assumption I'd been operating under. Margaret wasn't struggling financially at all. She had a comfortable pension from her years working as a school administrator, Social Security benefits, and significant savings. The money James had been sending her, he'd started sending it because she'd guilt-tripped him into it, claiming she wanted to save for retirement and needed help building her savings. But it wasn't about need, it was about want. She wanted extra money to spend on luxuries, on upgrades to her lifestyle, on things she desired but didn't need. And James, being the kind and loving son that he was, had agreed to help her even though it sometimes strained his own budget. But here's the thing that absolutely destroyed me. Here's the part that made me feel like such a fool. Such a complete and utter fool. In these emails, Margaret explicitly acknowledged that she didn't need the money to survive, that she had enough to cover her basic expenses, that this was extra money for her to enjoy her life more fully. She thanked James for being so generous and for caring about her happiness. There was even an email where James gently suggested that maybe they should reduce the amount he was sending because he was trying to save for a house with me, and Margaret had gotten upset, accused him of not caring about her, manipulated him emotionally until he agreed to keep sending the full amount. Reading those emails, seeing the manipulation in black and white, understanding that this pattern had continued with me after James's death, except now I was the one being manipulated, I felt a rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. This woman I'd been sacrificing for, this woman I'd gone hungry for, this woman I'd destroyed my own financial stability for, she didn't need my money at all. She'd been taking it because she could. Because I was too grief-stricken and too committed to honoring James's memory to question her, because she saw an opportunity to continue the gravy train even after her son was gone. I thought about all the times I'd eaten instant noodles for dinner while she was dining at expensive restaurants. I thought about the time my electricity had been shut off for 3 days because I couldn't afford the bill after sending her that month's payment, while she was redecorating her apartment with designer furniture. I thought about skipping necessary medical care, ignoring that persistent cough that wouldn't go away, putting off dental work I desperately needed, all so I could send money to a woman who was using it to fund a lifestyle of leisure and luxury. The betrayal cut so deep, felt so personal and so cruel, that I literally doubled over in pain, sobbing uncontrollably on my bedroom floor, surrounded by the remnants of my dead husband's life, realizing that the promise he'd asked me to make had been based on a lie, a manipulation that his mother had orchestrated and that had continued long after he was gone. She had looked me in the eye at his funeral, had hugged me while I cried, had accepted my money month after month for years, all while knowing she didn't need it, knowing I was struggling, knowing she was taking advantage of my grief and my love for her son. I don't know how long I sat there on that floor, cycling through shock, grief, anger, and a profound sense of betrayal that seemed to hollow me out from the inside. Eventually, I gathered up all the evidence, the bank statements, the emails, screenshots of her social media posts showing her expensive purchases and activities. I needed to confront her, needed to hear her try to explain this, needed to look her in the eye and demand the truth. But I also needed to be strategic because part of me, the part that had been conditioned by years of being taken advantage of, was worried she would somehow talk her way out of this, would manipulate me again, would make me feel guilty for questioning her. So I spent the next few days preparing, organizing all my evidence, calculating exactly how much money I'd sent her over the past 4 years. The total came to $18,240. $18,000 that I couldn't afford, that had been extracted from my life at great personal cost, that had gone to fund someone else's comfortable lifestyle while I struggled and suffered. The number made me feel physically ill, made me realize just how thoroughly I'd been used. I also discovered, through some additional research, that Margaret had never told any of her friends or other family members about the arrangement we had, which meant she knew on some level that what she was doing was wrong, that it wouldn't hold up to scrutiny, that people would judge her for taking money from her dead son's struggling widow. She'd kept it secret, which proved she had a conscience somewhere in there, buried beneath the greed and manipulation, but that somehow made it worse, made it clear that this was calculated and deliberate rather than thoughtless. When I finally worked up the courage to confront Margaret, I drove to her apartment on a Thursday afternoon, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times, but when she opened the door with that familiar smile that now seemed so fake and predatory, all my carefully planned words evaporated. I walked into her living room, looking around at all the nice things she'd bought with money that should have gone to helping me rebuild my life after losing her son, and I felt a cold fury settle over me. I didn't sit down when she offered me a seat. I stood there, pulled out the folder of evidence I'd brought, and I asked her directly, "Why did you tell me you needed my money to survive when you were already financially comfortable? Why did you take $18,000 from me over 4 years when you knew I was struggling? Why did you betray the memory of your own son by manipulating his widow?" Margaret's face went through a series of rapid changes: shock, fear, defensiveness, and then, finally, a kind of resigned guilt. She tried to stammer out some excuses, saying she'd never said she needed the money to survive, just that it would help, saying that I'd offered and she'd accepted, saying that it wasn't her responsibility to manage my finances. But I cut through all of that, showed her the emails between her and James, pointed out all the lies she'd told, confronted her with evidence of her trips and purchases and comfortable lifestyle. She finally broke down and admitted that yes, she didn't need the money, that she'd gotten used to the extra income from James and hadn't wanted to give it up, that when I'd offered to help, she'd seen it as a continuation of what she'd already been receiving. She said, in a voice that seemed to believe this was somehow a defense, that I'd never asked about her actual financial situation, that I'd just assumed she needed help and she'd let me continue assuming it. The lack of remorse in her voice, the way she was trying to shift responsibility onto me for not asking the right questions, made me realize that this woman was never going to truly apologize, was never going to acknowledge the full extent of what she'd done. I asked her if she had any idea what those 4 years had been like for me, if she'd ever wondered why I looked so tired and worn down during my rare visits, if she'd cared at all that I was sacrificing my own well-being for her comfort. She had the audacity to say that I'd seemed fine, that she hadn't known I was struggling, which was such an obvious lie given that she knew I was now living on 1 income instead of 2, and that losing a spouse generally comes with financial hardship. I told her that I would never forgive her for this, that she had betrayed not just me but the memory of her own son, who I knew would be horrified if he knew what she'd done. I told her the payments would stop immediately, that I would never give her another cent, and that I wanted her out of my life completely. She started crying then. Real tears or manipulative ones, I couldn't tell and didn't care, saying that I was all she had left of James, that she didn't want to lose me too. But I was done, completely and utterly done. I walked out of that apartment and never looked back, blocking her number, blocking her on social media, cutting her out of my life as completely as if she'd never existed. The grief I felt in the days and weeks after that confrontation was different from the grief I'd felt after losing James. This was a grief for innocence lost, for trust betrayed, for years of my life wasted on someone who never deserved my sacrifice. I want to tell you what I did next because I think it's important for anyone who might be going through something similar to know that you can recover from this kind of betrayal, that you can rebuild and reclaim your life. First, I had to forgive myself for being taken advantage of, had to accept that being manipulated doesn't make you stupid or weak, it just makes you human and trusting and willing to honor your commitments. I worked with my therapist extensively on this, on understanding that my willingness to sacrifice for someone I thought needed help was actually a beautiful quality that had been exploited, not a character flaw. I had to grieve not just for James, but for the version of myself who had believed in the inherent goodness of family, who had thought that loving someone meant their family would never hurt you. I also had to get practical about my financial situation, which had been devastated by 4 years of payments I couldn't afford. I worked with a financial counselor to create a budget, to understand how to rebuild my savings, to start paying down the debt I'd accumulated while sending Margaret that money every month. It was humbling and difficult to realize how much damage had been done, but also empowering to take control of my finances for the first time in years. Slowly, month by month, without that $380 obligation hanging over me, I started to see progress. I could afford to go to the doctor when I needed to. I could buy fresh vegetables instead of just pasta and rice. I could start saving a little bit each month, building an emergency fund that gave me a sense of security I hadn't felt since James died. The financial recovery took time, years actually, but the emotional recovery took even longer. I had to learn how to trust again, how to not see manipulation and ulterior motives in every kind gesture from others. I had to learn how to set boundaries, how to say no without guilt, how to protect myself while still remaining open to genuine connection with people. My friends, especially Rachel, who had tried to warn me about the situation with Margaret, were incredibly supportive, never saying "I told you so," but instead just being there for me as I processed everything. I started dating again eventually, though it was terrifying to open my heart after everything I'd been through. I met someone wonderful, someone who respected my boundaries and understood my history, and never tried to take advantage of my generous nature. We've built a relationship based on honesty and mutual respect, something I never fully had even with James because he'd been keeping the truth about his mother's financial situation from me. I think James had good intentions. I think he loved his mother and loved me and was trying to navigate a difficult situation. But the foundation of dishonesty that Margaret had built meant that even his final request to me was based on false pretenses. I've made peace with that complexity, with the understanding that people we love can still make mistakes, can still participate in systems of manipulation, even if they don't fully realize what they're doing. What I haven't made peace with, and probably never will, is the deliberate, calculated way that Margaret took advantage of me for 4 years, looked me in the eye month after month, and took money she knew I couldn't afford to give. The experience fundamentally changed how I approach relationships and commitments. I learned that honoring someone's memory doesn't mean destroying yourself in the process, that true love and respect would never ask you to sacrifice your own well-being for someone else's comfort, especially when that sacrifice isn't even necessary. I learned to ask questions, to verify information, to trust my instincts when something feels off instead of pushing those feelings away because they're uncomfortable. I learned that some people will take everything you're willing to give, without any regard for what it costs you, and that protecting yourself from those people isn't selfish, it's necessary. I also learned about the complicated nature of family obligations and how grief can be weaponized by people who know you're vulnerable. Margaret knew I was drowning in grief when she accepted my offer of financial help. She knew I was looking for ways to maintain a connection to James, to feel like I was doing something meaningful in his memory. And she exploited that knowledge, exploited my pain, exploited my love for her son to enrich herself at my expense. That's not something I can forgive, and I don't think I should have to. Forgiveness isn't always the answer. Sometimes holding people accountable for their actions and removing them from your life is the healthier choice. Now, 5 years after that confrontation, I'm in a completely different place in my life. I'm financially stable for the first time since James died. I've paid off my debt, I have savings, I can afford small luxuries without guilt or stress. I've built a career I'm proud of, working as a freelance writer, which gives me flexibility and creative fulfillment. I have a partner who loves and respects me, who would never ask me to sacrifice myself for anyone, who celebrates my strength and supports my healing. I've reconnected with hobbies I'd abandoned during those dark years, started hiking again, which was something James and I used to love doing together, and found that I can enjoy those activities and honor his memory without it being painful. I've learned to remember James with love and gratitude for the time we had together, while also acknowledging that his death doesn't define my entire existence, that I'm allowed to move forward and build a new life. The experience with Margaret, as painful and devastating as it was, taught me invaluable lessons about self-worth, boundaries, and the importance of protecting yourself even when you're trying to be generous and kind. It taught me that you can't pour from an empty cup, that taking care of yourself isn't selfish, and that people who truly care about you will never want you to suffer for their benefit. If you've read this far, if my story has resonated with you in any way, I want you to know that you're not alone if you've been taken advantage of by someone you trusted. Whether it's a family member, a friend, a romantic partner, or anyone else who has exploited your generosity or your grief or your love, it's not your fault. Being kind and trusting and willing to help others are beautiful qualities, and the fact that someone abused those qualities says everything about them and nothing about you. You deserve to protect yourself, to set boundaries, to say no when something feels wrong, or when you can't afford to say yes. You deserve to be treated with respect and honesty, and you don't have to accept manipulation or exploitation just because it's coming from someone who's supposed to care about you. Please, if you're in a situation where someone is taking advantage of you financially or emotionally, start asking questions, start verifying information, start trusting your instincts. Don't wait 4 years like I did. Don't sacrifice your own well-being for someone who doesn't actually need your sacrifice. And don't let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting yourself. I'm sharing this story not for pity or sympathy, but because I know there are others out there who might be going through something similar. who might be questioning whether they're being taken advantage of, but talking themselves out of those suspicions because confronting the truth is too painful. Trust yourself. Protect yourself. Honor your commitments when they're based on honesty and genuine need, but don't destroy yourself for people who are using you. Have you ever been in a situation where someone you trusted betrayed you financially or emotionally? Have you ever sacrificed more than you should have for someone who didn't deserve it? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below because sharing our experiences helps all of us feel less alone and helps others recognize when they might be in similar situations. If this story touched your heart or taught you something about the importance of setting boundaries and protecting yourself, please leave a like on this video. Your support means everything and helps this message reach more people who might need to hear it. And if you want to hear more stories about life lessons, overcoming betrayal, finding strength in difficult situations, and building a life you're proud of after devastating setbacks, please subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. I share these deeply personal experiences because I believe in the power of truth, in the importance of learning from each other's mistakes and triumphs, and in the resilience of the human spirit. Thank you for listening to my story, for being here with me, for taking the time to understand what I went through and hopefully taking something valuable away from it. Remember, you are stronger than you think. You deserve to be treated with respect and honesty, and protecting yourself is never something you should feel guilty about. Take care of yourselves, set those boundaries, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that suffering in silence is somehow noble or loving. You deserve better, and I hope my story helps you recognize that and act on it.